If you're watching this story unfold, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Yeah. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because this is the kind of story you don't want to walk away from in the middle. Whitmore stood in the dirt with one suitcase and a dead man's debt, and a stranger just bought her future. Until the very end, because nothing about this ends the way you think it will. The morning they buried her father, Clara Whitmore did not cry. She had already used up every tear she had during the 3 nights he lay dying in the back room of their small house on Millard Street, coughing until there was nothing left of him. She had held his hand through the worst of it. She had told him it would be all right, even when she knew it wouldn't. She had been 19 years old and trying to hold a collapsing world together with bare hands, and by the time Reverend Holt said the full words over the grave, Clara had nothing left inside her chest but a hollow, terrible stillness. She stood at the edge of the grave in her mother's black dress, her mother who had died 7 years before and left behind only that dress, and the memory of a woman who had laughed easily, and she watched the dirt fall, and she did not make a sound. People in Caldwell Creek said she was cold. They had been saying things about Clara Whitmore for years. She was too quiet. She was too plain. She was too old at 19 to still be unmarried, though 3 men had tried, and 2 of them had been the kind of trying that left bruises. Had books she kept under her bed. She could read ledger columns faster than the bank clerk. She had opinions she was not always wise enough to keep to herself. Her father had called her his smartest child, which would have been a greater compliment if she hadn't also been his only child. And if he hadn't died and left her with $437 of debt to a man named Gerald Holt, the Reverend's brother, which Clara always found grimly fitting, the way sin and Scripture lived so close together in this town. Gerald Holt was not a man who waited long after funerals. He came to the house that same afternoon, while Clara was still wearing the black dress, and had not yet eaten and still had grave dirt on her shoes. He knocked twice, and, when she opened the door, he took off his hat in the manner of a man who had practiced politeness without ever learning it, and he told her what she already knew. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Whitmore. Truly I am." He held his hat against his chest like a prop. "But the note your father signed comes due at the end of this month, and I think you and I both understand that you are not in a position to satisfy it." "I understand the note, Mr. Holt. $437 is a significant sum." "I know what the sum is." He looked past her into the house. His eyes moved the way a merchant's eyes move when they're calculating value. "House alone won't cover it. Maybe. Combined with the property, I'm prepared to be generous in my assessment, Miss Whitmore. Out of respect for your father. My father is not yet cold." "No," he agreed, "but the calendar doesn't stop for grief, I'm afraid." He put his hat back on. "I'll give you until the end of the month. I think that's more than fair." You might want to start thinking about your options." He left. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the hollow place in her chest got a little larger. She spent 3 days trying to find options. She went to every merchant in Caldwell Creek. She had helped her father with accounts for 6 years. She knew numbers, knew how to track inventory and balance books and spot the places where money was quietly disappearing. She offered her services to the general store, to the freight office, to the small hotel at the end of Main Street. The general store owner told her he already had a boy who handled his accounts. The freight office manager looked at she had said something amusing. The hotel owner was more direct. "You're a young woman, Miss Whitmore. There's only one kind of work for a young woman without family connections, and I don't run that kind of establishment. I'd suggest you start looking for a husband." She walked home and sat at her father's desk and put her face in her hands. She was not going to find a husband in 3 weeks. She was not going to find an employment situation that paid $437 in 3 weeks. She was not going to find anything, because she was Clara Whitmore, and Caldwell Creek had already decided what she was worth, and the number was considerably less than $437. On the fourth day, Mrs. Adeline Pruett came to her door. Mrs. Pruett was 70 years old and had outlived two husbands and one of her children, and had arrived at a place in life where she felt no obligation to speak anything but the plain truth. She had brought a covered dish of something that smelled like chicken, and a look on her face that Clara had come to recognize as the expression women wore when they were about to say something that would hurt. "Sit down, child," Clara sat. "Gerald Holt is telling people about the debt, Mrs." Pruett set the dish on the table and folded her hands. "He's been talking to Thomas Argent." Clara knew the name. Everyone in the county knew Thomas Argent. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, a sprawling cattle operation that had swallowed 3 smaller properties in the past decade. He was 51 years old and had buried one wife, and she had reportedly died of exhaustion, though the official accounting was a fever. He had a son from that first marriage who ran roughshod over half the town and a reputation for collecting things: land, livestock, debts, women with the same flat-eyed efficiency. "What does Thomas Argent want with my father's debt?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. She just needed to hear it said out loud so she could stop hoping she was wrong. Mrs. Pruett did not look away. "He wants to pay it off. In exchange for the house, and for you." There it was. "He's looking for a wife," Mrs. Pruett continued. "His son's been causing trouble, and he thinks a woman in the house would settle things down. He's made inquiries about several girls in the county. Most of them have fathers who can negotiate. You don't have that advantage. I'm not a piece of property, no. But the law doesn't always agree with you on that, Mrs." Voice was matter of fact, not unkind. "You should know what's coming. Gerald Holt will give you until the end of the month, and then he'll foreclose, and then Thomas Argent will make his offer, and you'll have very few ways to say no." Clara ate the chicken. She thanked Mrs. Pruett. She sat alone in her dead father's house after the old woman left, and she thought about every option she could still see in front of her. One by one, like candles in a wind, they went out. She was still sitting there at midnight when she heard the hoofbeats. She didn't go to the window and pass, slow and heavy, the etter, and then stop. And then there was the sound of a horse being tied, and then boots on the porch. A knock, not aggressive, not polite. Just 2 solid strikes of a fist against wood, the knock of a person who wasn't asking permission so much as announcing presence. Clara opened the door. The man standing on her porch was tall enough that she had to look up, which didn't happen often. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set against hard weather. For so long it had simply stayed that way. He wore a battered brown coat despite the summer heat. There was a scar along his right hand, visible in the lamplight spilling from the doorway, running from the base of his thumb nearly to his wrist. He was not holding his hat. He was not smiling. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way men sometimes looked at things they were trying to figure out if they were going to have to carry. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am, Everett Hayes." He said you'd see the name of a place on a map. "Just information. I heard you've got a debt problem." "I heard you live up on the mountain," she said. "I also heard you don't come to town." "I don't." He glanced past her into the house, briefly then back. "Adeline Pruett sent me a letter. She had things to say." Clara would revisit her feelings about Mrs. Pruett later. "Does a mountain cowboy want with my debt problem?" Everett Hayes considered that for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with words. He let the question there be until it was good and ready to be answered. "Thomas Argent has been trying to push into the northern grazing land for 2 years, he said finally. "And that runs along my property line. He can't do it legally, while certain deeds and water rights are held by smaller owners. Your father's property sits between Argent's eastern boundary and the creek access I need for my cattle." He paused. "If Argent gets your father's land, he gets my water." "So this is about water rights." "Partly. What's the other part?" Looked at her directly. His eyes were the color of creek water under cloud shadow, and they were very steady. Adeline Pruitt said you were smart enough to keep a ranch's books and too stubborn to starve quietly. I've been needing someone to manage my accounts since my foreman left in the spring. I have $437. He let that land. I have a proposal. Clara held the door. She did not step back to let him in. You're a stranger. Yes, you want me to come live on your ranch. In a separate room, with a lock on the door. I'll show you the key before you decide. He said it flat, like he'd anticipated the question and wanted it out of the way. This is a business arrangement. You manage my accounts, keep the books, help me hold the land through the winter. In return, I pay your debt, and you have a roof and wages until you decide what you want to do next. And if I want to leave, you leave. He said it without hesitation. Anytime you want. I'm not buying you, Miss Whitmore. I'm offering you a job. She stood in the doorway of her father's house at midnight and looked at this large, scarred, unsmiling stranger who had ridden down from the mountain to offer her a way out, and she tried to find the angle she was missing. Because in her experience, there was always an angle. There was always the thing underneath the thing, the want, that didn't get said out loud until it was too late to run. Why, she asked. You could hire a man for this. You could hire 10 men. Something moved across Everett Hayes's face. It was there and gone too fast to name. You don't do well with men who want to argue with me, he said. Adeline said you were practical. Adeline says a lot of things. Nay, she does. And they're barely the smallest possible concession, the edge of something that might have been, in a different man, a smile. She's usually right. Clara stood there for another long moment. She thought about Thomas Argent and his 51 years and his dead wife and his troublemaking son. She thought about Gerald Holt and the end of the month. She thought about the hotel owner who had suggested she find a husband. She thought about her father's desk and the empty ledger columns and the way the number 437 had been sitting on her chest like a stone for 4 days. Show me the key first, she said. He reached into his coat pocket and held it out. It was an ordinary iron key, nothing remarkable about it. He dropped it in her palm. The lock is already on the door, he said. I put it on 2 days ago. She looked at him. You were that certain I'd say yes? No, he said. I was that certain you deserved to have the choice. She told Gerald Holt the next morning. He stood behind his desk at the bank with his hat in his hands again, and his practiced politeness gone slightly thin around the edges, because whatever he had been expecting, this was not it. Everett Hayes, he repeated. He's paying the note in full. Miss Whitmore, I'm not sure you understand who you're dealing with. Hayes is the man is not. Holt stopped, started again. He's not a sociable man. He lives alone up there for a reason. People have talked. People in this town talk about everything, Clara said. They talked about me too. It didn't make any of what they said true. She left before he could find another way to say what he was actually trying to say, which was that a young woman going to live on a mountain with a man like Everett Hayes was the kind of thing that ended reputation. As if she had a reputation left to end, she went back to the house. She packed her suitcase. She put her mother's black dress on top and her father's account ledgers on top of that, because she wasn't leaving the ledgers. She'd kept those books since she was 13, and they were the only inheritance she had that no one could put a price on. Mrs. Pruitt at the gate as she was coming out. You're going, the old woman said. You sent him a letter, Clara said. It was not an accusation. She had thought about it, and she had decided it wasn't. I did. Mrs. Pruitt did not look apologetic. He's a hard man, Clara. He's been through things, but he's a fair one. There's a difference between hard and cruel, and Everett Hayes has never been cruel. She paused. You'll figure that out yourself. You could have told me first. I would have said no out of pride. Mrs. Pruitt tilted her head slightly. Could I be wrong? Clara picked up her suitcase. Goodbye, Adeline. Word when you're settled. A pause. And don't let him scare you. He leads with the scar and the silence. Most men who've been hurt do. Dad, up to the Hayes Ranch, took the better part of a morning. She rode the second horse he had brought down, a steady bay mare who didn't spook at anything, and Everett Hayes rode ahead without a great deal of conversation. He answered the questions she asked and did not volunteer much beyond that. She asked about the ranch. He told her, 1,200 acres, cattle operation, 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, a foreman position that was currently empty, a barn that needed work on the east wall before winter. She asked about the trouble with Thomas Argent. He told her. Argent had been blocking his access to the eastern grazings land for 2 years, through a combination of legal challenges to deed boundaries and the simple physical tactic of putting his cattle on Hayes' land and letting the situation become someone else's problem to prove. Lawsuits neither resolved. A county surveyor who was, in Everett's estimation, on Argent's payroll asked why he hadn't hired a lawyer. He said he'd had one. The man had developed an interest in practicing law in Denver. Argent paid him off, Clara said. That's my assumption. You need records, then, not just the current book's historical ones. Land use, water access, what you've grazed and when and where. You can show a consistent pattern of use that predates Argent's claims. She stopped. Caught herself. Sorry, I don't know all the facts yet. He had turned slightly in the saddle to look at her. Don't apologize for that. For what? For knowing things. He turned back. Most people don't do it in my direction. She let that sit for a while, turning it over, trying to understand what it meant. He said it without self-pity, just stated it like a fact about the weather. And Clara, who had spent most of her life being told to keep her knowing to herself, found something in that strange and quiet acknowledgement that she did not entirely know what to do with. The ranch was not what she had pictured. She wasn't certain what she'd pictured. Grim. Something that matched the man. What she found instead was a place that was plainly, practically, competently built. A kind of property that had been worked hard for a long time by someone who knew what they were doing. The main house was timber and stone, larger than she'd expected, with a covered porch that faced the valley below and a kitchen garden someone had clearly been attempting to maintain through a brutal summer. The barn was big, the corral held good horses. Everything was functional rather than beautiful, but there was a care to it that showed in the straight fence lines and the well-positioned water trough and the way the woodpile was stacked against the north wall, out of the wind. 3 ranch hands, a young man named Jesse, a weathered Mexican cowboy named Paz, and a quite older man everyone called Dutch met them in the yard. They were politely expressionless in the way of men who had been warned to be politely expressionless and were doing their best. Jesse could not entirely suppress his curiosity. He was maybe 20, freckled, and bad at hiding things. "You're the one who's going to fix the books?" he asked. "That's the plan," Clara said. "The books are pretty bad," he said. "Jesse," Everett said. Jesse found somewhere else to look. Dutch touched his hat brim in Clara's direction without comment. Paz did the same with slightly more warmth, which wasn't a lot of warmth but was clearly the genuine article. Everett showed her the house. The room he had prepared for her was at the back of the main floor, with a window that faced toward the tree line and a narrow bed and a small desk that had been cleared and left empty, which she understood was intentional. He showed her the key. He showed her the lock on the door. He told her the kitchen was hers to use whenever she wanted, that there was no expectation that she cook for the household, and that the accounts were in the study whenever she was ready. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. He looked slightly surprised, like he'd expected her to need more than 5 minutes to settle in. "Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll need to understand the full picture before I can help you. Everything, land records, water rights history, all of it. If we're going to build a legal case against Argent's boundary claims, we need to know exactly what we have." He nodded once. Turned to Hayes, he stopped. "I'm not going to be a problem," she said. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to say it. "I'm here to work." He looked at her for a moment. "I didn't think you would be," he said. "If I'd thought that, I wouldn't have come down the mountain." He left. Clara stood in the room with the iron key in her hand, and the lock on the door and the east-facing window with its view of the tree line, and she tried to determine what kind of situation she had actually walked into. It did not feel like any of the situations she had feared. It felt strange and uncertain and precarious in all the ways that new things were precarious. But it did not feel like a trap, which was more than she could say for most of the options Caldwell Creek had laid in front of her. She started the accounts the next morning. The state of Everett Hayes's books was, as Jesse had accurately if tactlessly reported, not good. Not because of any dishonesty, the records were all there, every transaction accounted for in someone's heavy, effortful handwriting, but because no one had organized them in any systematic way. There were receipts stuffed between pages. There were expense columns with no corresponding income entries. There was an entire season's worth of cattle sales recorded in a different ledger from the corresponding feed costs, so that the ranch looked profitable in one book and nearly bankrupt in another. She worked through it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she came to find Everett in the barn, where he was working on the east wall Jesse had mentioned. He was shirtless, despite the summer heat not yet rising to anything truly punishing. The altitude took the edge off, and she registered this in the purely practical sense of a person who had grown up on a working property and understood that meant doing physical labor in summer removed their shirts, which was a fact about weather and work, and not anything else. He saw her, reached for his shirt where it hung on a nail, pulled it on. Is it? I need you to tell me about the eastern boundary dispute, she said. Specifically, I need to know the exact date Argent first challenged the deed. And I need to know if you have any records before 1870. He looked at her steadily. I have records back to 1865. My father built this place. The deed goes back to a land grant. You have the original grant document. In the strongbox. Need to see it. He came down from the wall, didn't ask why. Just led her back to the house, to the study, heavy iron strongbox in the corner, and opened it. He pulled out a rolled document that was 15 years old, and handed it to her. She unrolled it on the desk and read it. Then she read it again. She felt something shift in her chest, not the hollow, terrible stillness of grief this time, but something sharper. Something that might have been the particular satisfaction of a person who has found the thing they were looking for. Mr. Hayes, she said, look at this line here, she pointed. Language. The grant specifies not just the land boundaries but the water sources. It names the creek by its original surveying designation. She looked up at him. Argent's deed named the creek. He was reading. She watched him read. He was a slow reader, not because he was slow, she had already understood, but because he read carefully, weighing each word. No, he said after a moment, it names the eastern grazing land. Not the water, which means his deed never legally included creek access. She straightened. His water boundary claim is based on a deed that doesn't actually say what he says it says. If we can get a copy of his deed and put it next to yours in front of a judge who isn't bought. The circuit court judge comes through in September, Everett said. He was still looking at the document. Hendricks. He's out of Denver. Argent doesn't have connections in Denver. Then we have until September to build the full case. Clara looked at the piles of records she'd spent the last 4 days sorting through. I can do that. I'll need your foreman's records, from the past 5 years, the grazing logs, where you moved the cattle and when. Establishes use patterns, and I'll need Miss Whitmore. She stopped. Everett Hayes was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter than both. That in 4 days, he said. I found it in 2. I spent 2 more days making sure I wasn't missing something. Quieter than surprise expression, deepened slightly. He looked back at the document, then at her, and there was something careful in his face that she would spend a long time learning to read. My lawyers spent 8 months on this, he said. Both of them. Your lawyers were probably looking for things they already knew how to find, she said. I was just reading what it actually said. A pause. What do you need from me? He asked. It was a different kind of question than the ones he'd asked before. Less transactional, time, she said, and access to everything you have. And someone to ride with me to the county land office in Salter so I can pull Argent's deed and compare it properly. He said, I'll ride with you myself. She looked at him for a moment. In the summer light through the study window, with the original land grant spread across his father's desk and 4 months of legal ammunition waiting in stacks of ledger books, Everett Hayes did not look like the monster of the mountain. He looked like a man who had been fighting alone for a very long time and had just been told he might not have to be. She wasn't sure either of them knew what to do with that yet. Tomorrow morning, then, she said. Tomorrow morning, he agreed. She gathered the documents she needed. She went back to her room with the lock on the door and the iron key that she hadn't used once since she arrived, because she had not, in 4 days, and felt the need to. She sat at the small desk and opened her notebook and started writing down everything she knew about Thomas Argent's boundary claims, and everything she was going to need to prove he was wrong. And the satisfaction in her chest was warm and specific and entirely her own. She had not felt that way in a long time. Outside, the summer mountain was doing what summer mountains do, holding all that sky, indifferent and enormous and quietly magnificent, and down in the yard, she could hear Jessie talking to one of the horses. And Pa's singing something low in Spanish, and the steady rhythm of Everett Hayes's hammer against the east wall of the barn. She started writing. The ride to Salter took 3 hours, and Clara spent most of it going over what she already knew in her head, arranging facts the way she arranged ledger columns by weight, by relevance, by what they could prove and what they could only suggest. Everett rode beside her rather than ahead. She noticed that. He had ridden ahead on the way up to the ranch, and she had understood that as the behavior of a man accustomed to being alone, moving at his own pace without accounting for another person's presence. Today he matched her mare's stride without comment, without making a point of it, the way a person does a thing they've simply decided to do. He didn't talk for the first hour. She was the one who broke it. How long has Argent been making moves on your land? 2 years of legal claims, Everett said. 4 years of smaller things before that. Moving fence lines, letting his cattle drift. Things that are hard to prove and easy to call accidents. He's been building toward something. He's been building toward owning the whole northern valley. He said it without particular heat. Just fact. He's got the southern range. He's got 2 of the 4 properties that used to run along the creek. Your father's land was the 3rd. Clara felt something cold move through her, despite the summer warmth. He was buying up the creek access systematically. Yes, and he used my father's debt to do it. She heard her own voice and was slightly surprised by how level it stayed. Gerald Holt didn't just happen to hold that note. Argent pointed him at it. Everett glanced at her. That's my thinking. Can't prove it, not yet. Another stretch of quiet. The horses moved through it easily. Your father, did he know about the property's value to Argent? You don't think so, Clara said. My father knew farming and accounting and not much else about land strategy. Meant he wouldn't have understood what the creek access meant to someone putting together a large operation. She paused. He should have, maybe. But he didn't. A lot of people don't, Everett said. Until someone's already taken what they had. She looked at him when he said that. The way he said it wasn't general. It was specific in the way that personal experience makes things specific. She filed it away and didn't ask about it yet. The land office in Salter was a single room with a bored-looking clerk named Patterson, who brightened considerably at the arrival of any human being and became nearly effusive when Clara told him she needed to pull historical deed records for the Argent property. Argent, Patterson repeated. He glanced at Everett with the slightly apprehensive expression people in these towns often wore when looking at Everett Hayes. That's a significant holding. You looking at the main parcel or the acquisitions? All of it, Clara said. Every deed, every transfer, every recorded easement. I need the full history back to the original grants. Patterson looked at the size of that request. He looked at Clara. He looked at Everett. Everett said nothing. He leaned against the wall and crossed his arms, and was very still in the manner of a large, patient animal that intends to be there for as long as it takes. Patterson pulled the records. Clara worked through them at the clerk's table while Everett stood nearby and said nothing, which she was already learning was one of his most useful qualities. Didn't hover. He didn't interject. Nay, he was simply there, available. And quiet. And she could think. She found what she was looking for 40 minutes in. Mr. Hayes. She kept her voice neutral because Patterson was in the room. Come look at this. He came. She pointed to the language in Argent's primary deed, the one his father had filed in 1871, the one the boundary dispute was built on. Everett read it. She watched him read it the same way she'd watched him the day before, careful and slow. It doesn't say the creek, he said. It says Eastern Water Access, Clara said. Argent has been arguing in court means the creek. Look at the original survey map attached here. She turned the page. Eastern Water Access, marked on this survey, is a seasonal spring. It's not the creek. The creek isn't even marked on his survey, because the creek was on your father's land and they didn't survey it. Everett straightened. He was quiet for a moment that felt different from his usual quiet, charged, rather than settled. His lawyers have been arguing water rights he doesn't have, he said. In front of judges who probably didn't have the original survey in front of them, only the deed language. She looked up at him. We need a certified copy of this, both pages, and I need to write to the Territorial Surveyor's Office for the original survey records from 1865. How long will that take? 3 weeks for the survey records if we're lucky. Circuit court date is in September. We have time. She paused. Nearly. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not the way faces shift in stories. Just a small definitive movement around his eyes. What do you need from Patterson? Certified copies of everything I just showed you. And his cooperation in not mentioning this visit Tika connected to Argent. She glanced at the clerk, who had been making a studious effort to appear absorbed in something on the other side of the room. Patterson, the clerk turned. Who does Thomas Argent talk to in this office? Patterson went slightly pale. Ma'am, I'm not sure I should. A county employee, she said. Not Argent's employee. There's a legal proceeding coming before the circuit court, and these records are going to be evidence. If someone interferes with them, that's a criminal matter. She held his gaze. Not asking you to do anything wrong. I'm asking you to do your job correctly and not tell anyone we were here until after the September court date. That's all. Patterson looked at Everett, who said nothing. Who just looked back. Yes, ma'am, Patterson said. I can do that. She got the certified copies. She thanked Patterson. Nay. She folded the documents into the leather satchel she'd brought and walked out into the summer afternoon, and it was only when they were back on the horses and moving that she let herself exhale fully. It was well done, Everett said. Patterson was nervous. Patterson has reason to be. He's been Argent's man in that office for 2 years. He glanced at her. You knew that, I suspected it. The way he looked at you when I mentioned Argent's name, she adjusted her grip on the reins. He'll still tell him eventually. We have maybe 2 weeks before Argent knows someone pulled his deed records. What does that change? It means he'll start looking for ways to move faster. He's been patient because he thought he had time. She looked at the road ahead. We just told him he doesn't. Everett was quiet for a moment. Are you always this far ahead? My father used to say I thought like a chess player. She paused. He meant it as a compliment. My teacher at school said the same thing and did not mean it that way at all. Made a sound that might, in another man, have been a short laugh. In Everett Hayes, it was just a sound, but she catalogued it anyway. They were halfway back to the ranch when the second horse appeared on the ridge above the road. Everett saw it before she did. She knew because he straightened slightly in the saddle, a small shift that was his equivalent of someone else snapping to full alert. The time she followed his gaze, The rider was already picking his way down toward them, and she recognized a big gray that she'd seen in the livery stable in Caldwell Creek before she recognized the man. It was Argent's son, Wade Argent. He was 24 and had his father's coloring and none of his patience, which made him more immediately dangerous in certain ways and less in others. He pulled up the gray and blocked the road with the particular brand of casual insolence that required significant practice to achieve. "Hayes," he said. He looked at Clara afterward, the way he looked at everything like he was deciding whether it was worth his time. "Didn't know you were coming down to Salter. Didn't know I needed to tell you," Everett said. His voice had not changed at all. He was perfectly still on his horse. "What were you doing at the land office?" "Looking at land records." "That's what land offices are for." Wade Argent smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve his eyes. "My father's going to want to know about this." "Your father can look at whatever records he wants," Everett said. "Public documents. That's the point." Wade's eyes moved back to Clara. "You're the Whitmore girl, the one Hayes bought." He said it deliberately, watching to see how it landed. "Meh." Clara held his gaze and said nothing. She had learned very young that responding to deliberate provocations was exactly what the person delivering them wanted. And she had trained herself out of it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that self-control was its own form of power. "Interesting company you're keeping, Hayes." Wade backed the gray horse one step, which was technically clearing the road but felt like a different kind of statement. "My father wants that northern water access before winter." "That hasn't changed." "Your father can want whatever he likes," Everett said. "Wanting and having are different things." Wade studied him for a moment. Then he touched his hat in a mockery of courtesy, the gesture aimed somewhere between the two of them, and meaning nothing good about either. He turned the gray and rode back toward the ridge. Clara waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded. "He followed us," she said, "or had someone watching the road." Everett started his horse forward again. "Argent has people in Salter. Then he already knows we pulled the deed." She thought through the implications quickly. "That's faster than I thought." Wade's impulsive. "His father isn't. Thomas Argent will think before he moves." Everett's voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it, not fear, exactly. "Me. Something older than fear. Something that came from 2 years of fighting the same battle and knowing the shape of the enemy. He'll move before September. What does that look like?" Last time he moved on one of the properties he wanted, the family's main water line developed a problem. He said it flat. The kind of problem that takes 3 weeks to fix in summer. Clara felt the implications settle into her. Water. Summer. Cattle, he'd sabotage your water supply. If he thinks we're close to something that can hurt him in court. Yes. She thought about the summer heat, and the cattle, and 1,200 acres that depended on creek access, and what 3 weeks without water meant for a cattle operation. It meant losing animals. It meant losing the season. It meant losing the kind of money that could force a sale, even when a man didn't want to sell. "Then we need to protect the water line," she said. "Jesse and Paz can do a check today when we get back." He paused. "I already sent Dutch this morning." She looked at him. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated that going to Salter would shake something loose," he said. "I didn't know what, I just knew it would." She sat with that for a moment. The way he thought, not fast, like her, but like someone who had learned to see the ground under the ground. Different shape from the way she worked. Not better or worse. Different. "We should move the main herd closer to the North Creek access tonight," she said. If someone's going to tamper with the water, they'll have to get past the cattle." He glanced at her again, and this time she caught the look before he could entirely compose his face back to its usual neutrality. It was not admiration exactly. It was something more specific than that. It was the look of a person who has spent a long time being the only one who could see certain things, and has just met someone who can see them too. "I'll tell Jesse when we get back," he said. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from the morning silence. And the morning had been two people still measuring the distance between themselves. Nan, this was something else. Me. This was two people who had been, no, without quite deciding to, then, working together and finding that the work fit. Dutch found the first tampered joint on the North Line 3 days later. Nay. He brought the section of pipe into the yard and showed it to Everett and Clara together, which Clara noticed the together and understood as Dutch's own quiet assessment of the situation. The old man didn't explain things twice and didn't talk to people he didn't think needed to be in the conversation. Nut, Dutch said. He pointed to the break in the iron coupling. Not cracked. Cut. Somebody did this careful, so it'd hold another day or two and then fail on its own. It would have looked like regular wear. Clara crouched and looked at the cut. Deliberate. The kind of cut made by someone who knew what they were doing. 2 nights ago, maybe 3, Dutch rubbed his jaw. Whoever it was knew where to go. You don't find this joint unless you know the line. Someone who's seen the ranch, Clara said. She looked up. Inside. Dutch and Everett exchanged a look. She caught it. You've had someone on your property, she said. It wasn't a question. There was a hand I let go in the spring, Everett said slowly. Morrison, the foreman, left. Man named Cade. He was working cattle, but he asked too many questions about the water setup. He paused. I didn't think much of it at the time. Argent planted him, Clara said. The silence that followed had a different quality than their usual silences. Heavier. She watched Everett's jaw tighten, the only outward sign of what was moving through him. She had started to learn his tells. They were small and infrequent and easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. Can you fix the coupling? She asked Dutch. Already did, he said. He also walked the rest of the line this morning. He reached into his coat and pulled out a rough hand-drawn map, just lines, not detailed, the practical notation of a man who didn't draw for art but for utility. 3 more places I'd check if I were them. I marked them. We should put eyes on them. We can watch them in rotation, Clara said. She looked at Everett. All 4 of us, 2-hour shifts, starting at dark. The cattle are already close to the creek. Anyone coming in from the north will have to move through the herd. Jesse, who had been standing at the edge of the yard during this whole exchange, trying to look like he was just happening to be there, said, I can do nights. I sleep bad anyway. Everett looked at him for a moment. Jesse was 20 in earnest and had the good sense to look directly back without flinching. You can take the first watch, Everett said. Dutch takes second. I'll take before dawn. And me, Clara said. Everett looked at her. I can watch a water line, she said. Rode fence with my father for 6 years. I know how to sit still in the dark and pay attention. He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him working through the objection, the one about her being a woman, or being a guest, or not being his responsibility to put in danger. And she could also see him working through the counter-argument, which was that she was right. And she would know it, and saying it out loud wouldn't change anything. Between Dutch and Pa's, he said finally, not alone. Between and Pa's, she agreed. Dutch, for his part, looked at her with the same careful, unhurried attention he'd used when he brought the pipe into the yard. And he folded up his map and put it back in his pocket. I'll show you where to stand, he said. It was 3 words more than he usually offered anyone, and she understood it for what it was. Night watches changed the ranch in a way that was hard to name but easy to feel. There is something about shared difficulty that does what shared ease never can. It removes the performance from a relationship. People stop being careful over just themselves and start being just themselves, because being careful takes energy, and there isn't energy to spare when you're standing in the dark at 2 in the morning listening for footsteps. Clara learned things on those night watches that she could not have learned any other way. She learned that Jesse talked to his horse. Like the horse was an old friend, he had strong opinions he needed to share, a constant low murmur of observations about the state of the world that the horse received with equanimity. She learned that Paz sang the same 3 songs every night in rotation and knew all the words to all of them and had a voice that was much better than his general demeanor suggested he'd allow himself to have. She learned that Dutch moved through the dark with the specific sureness of a man who has spent more of his life outside than in, and who navigated by feel and memory rather than by sight, and who took his responsibilities with a seriousness that had nothing performative in it. Yeah. And she learned things about Everett Hayes in the hours between when he took over from her and when the sun came up. Nina. The first morning, she was heading back to the house at the handoff, and he was walking out, and he had a thermos of coffee that he'd made in the dark kitchen because he'd gotten up early, which meant he'd gotten even less sleep than the schedule required. He offered her some without speaking, and she took it and drank half of it before she said anything, and he didn't seem to expect her to. "It's quiet up here," she said finally. I'd forgotten what quiet felt like. Hey. He looked at the sky in the direction of the east, which was just beginning to make the specific suggestion of dawn. "It's the thing I came up here for," he said. "To get away from noise? To get away from people deciding what I was before they knew me." He said it without apparent self-pity. Again, like a fact. Like a thing he'd thought about long enough that it had stopped hurting to say. "It's easier up here." She thought about that. "Doesn't it get lonely?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "just that. Not explained, not elaborated on. Just the plain truth of it." She handed the thermos back. "Thank you for the coffee. It's in the kitchen any time you want it." He paused. "You don't have to wait for me to make it." "I know," she looked at him. "But yours is better than mine." Something moved across his face again, that barely their thing that in another man would be a smile. "Sleep," he said. "I've got this." She went. She lay in her room in the early morning light and thought about what it meant to be up here with a man who had said he came here to escape people, deciding what he was before they knew him, and who had come down the mountain anyway for water rights. Yes. For land strategy. Yes. But also, she was starting to think, for a reason she didn't have a clean name for yet. He had put a lock on the door 2 days before he came to see her. He had been that certain she deserved to have the choice. She turned that over in the early morning quiet, and she didn't have any clean conclusions about it. But she held it carefully, the way she held things she didn't want to lose track of. On the 7th night, they caught one. It was just before 3 in the morning, and Clara was at her post between Dutch's position and Paz's, a stretch of fence line, near the second joint Dutch had marked on his map when she heard the cattle shift. Not the random, settled shifting of animals at rest. The purposeful pressing of a herd reacting to an unfamiliar presence among them. She stayed still and listened, a minute, 2 minutes. Then footsteps, careful, slow, the footsteps of someone trying very hard not to be heard, moving along the outer fence line toward the water junction. She didn't move. She counted seconds. At 10, she heard Dutch's low, the etcher whistle, from her left, which meant he'd heard it too. And she exhaled slowly and stayed exactly where she was, because Dutch had said the one time he'd given her instructions. "You hear something, you wait for my signal. Don't you move till then." She waited. The footsteps got closer. Dutch's second whistle, higher, was the signal. Dara stood up from the fence post and said clearly, into the dark, "Stop where you are." Figure froze. "There are 3 of us," she said. Which true pause had materialized on the right, moving silently in a way that suggested he'd done this before. "And we're not alone on the property. I'd think hard about what comes next." The figure bolted left. Directly into Dutch, who was not a large man, but was built like someone had assembled him from particularly dense wood, and who simply stepped into the path and let the figure run into him, and then caught the man's arm with both hands and held it. Jesse appeared from somewhere, because Jesse had apparently been unable to sleep again, and had come out on his own time and had been somewhere in the general vicinity. He was carrying a lantern. In the light, the man was younger than Clara had expected. Maybe 22. He had the look of someone who had been doing this kind of work long enough to be good at it, but not long enough to be smart about it. He was carrying a tool set designed for precision work on iron fittings. Lakera looked at the tools. She looked at the man. "You work for Argent," she said. Ed nothing. "You don't have to say it," she said. "The tools say it. No one wanders up a private mountain road at 3 in the morning with specialty pipe fittings by accident." She crouched to look at the set more closely. "These are machined, not standard issue. Someone ordered these specifically." Dutch held the man's arm, and the man was not going anywhere. "What do we do with him?" Jesse asked. He was trying to sound casual about it and almost managing it. 80. Clara looked at Everett, who had come from somewhere in the dark. She hadn't heard him coming, which said something about how he moved through his own land in the dark and was standing at the edge of the lantern circle. He had not said anything yet. He was looking at the young man with an expression she now recognized as the particular stillness of someone deciding something. "What's your name?" Everett asked. The man pressed his lips together. "You don't have to tell me," Everett said. "It doesn't change what happens." "Yeah. I'm going to ride to the sheriff's office in Caldwell Creek tomorrow morning with these tools and a description of what you were doing here, and the sheriff is going to look at the evidence and make a determination. You being cooperative or not doesn't change that." He paused. "But if you tell me who sent it you and you're willing to say so to the circuit court judge in September, I'll make sure the judge knows you cooperated." Anne looked at Everett. He looked at the lantern. He looked at Clara. "I don't know the man's name," he said finally. "I was hired through an intermediary, man named Cade." Clara went very still. Everett's expression didn't change, but she saw his right hand close into a partial fist at his side. He repeated, "He paid me and 3 others. We've been doing work on different properties in the valley for 6 months. The young man's voice had gone flat with a particular flatness of someone who has calculated their position and decided confession is the better option. "I don't know who the money comes from behind Cade." "Doesn't say, and we don't ask. But Cade would know," Clara said. Cade would know. She looked at Everett. He looked at her. They held that for a moment, the specific understanding passing between two people who have been working the same problem long enough to reach the same conclusion at the same time. It was the link. Cade connected the sabotage to Argent. And Cade, it turned out, was still in the valley. "Where is he?" Everett asked. The young man told them. Dutch released his arm. Jesse held the lantern. The moved in the dark, beyond the fence line, settling back into their ordinary nighttime patience. And Clara stood in the summer darkness on a mountain she had arrived on by desperation and circumstance, holding a piece of information that could change everything about the September court case, and feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safe. She wasn't naive enough to think this was safe. Something else. Something that had to do with standing on ground she understood, and being in the middle of a fight she knew how to help win. It wasn't until she was walking back to the house with the lantern Jesse had handed her, the documents and her notebook, waiting on the small desk in her room, that she registered the sound behind her and turned to find Everett Hayes 3 paces back. Having fallen into step in that way he had of simply being where he'd decided to be without announcing it. "Well," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Dutch gave me good instructions. Dutch gives everyone the same instructions." Most people flinch. He held her gaze. "You didn't." She thought about flinching, about all the things she'd been afraid of in the past month, the debt and the town, Ammon who'd looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. She thought about standing up from that fence post in the dark and announcing herself to someone she couldn't see. "I was afraid," she said. "I was just more afraid of what would happen if I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, carefully, like someone who had thought about it. First, he nodded. It was a small thing, but in Everett Hayes, small things had weight. "That's the only kind of courage that counts," he said. He held the door. She went inside. She sat at the small desk and opened her notebook and wrote down everything the young man had said, every word, in the order he'd said it, with the date and the time, because she already knew this wasn't a detail. This was evidence. This was the thread that, pulled correctly, could unravel everything, Thomas Argent, had spent years building. She wrote until the candle burned low. Outside, the pre-dawn mountain held its silence, and somewhere out there, Everett Hayes was keeping watch over his land, and the cattle were still, and the water was running clean through the fixed coupling. And for the first time since she had stood at the edge of her father's grave in her mother's black dress, with a hollow place in her chest, Clara Whitmore did not feel like a person who was simply surviving. She felt like a person who was fighting, and winning felt, she thought, like a real possibility. They found Cade in Salter, not through any dramatic piece of detective work through the young man's directions, which had been specific and vedette given, in the tone of someone who had intended to calculate, honor it, and a boarding house on the south end of town, third room on the left, man who paid his rent 2 weeks ahead and kept irregular hours. Everett rode out at first light with Dutch, and Clara stayed at the ranch with Jesse and Paz, and spent the 3 hours they were gone writing out a formal, detailed account of the previous night, date, time, description of the individual, tools recovered, exact words spoken in the precise language she had learned from 6 years of keeping her father's legal correspondence. When Everett came back, he came back alone. She was on the porch when he rode in. She saw immediately that something had happened, not by anything dramatic, but by the set of his jaw and the way he dismounted without his usual economy of motion, slightly more force than necessary. "Aid's gone," he said. She didn't say anything right away. She, that land, turned it over, looked at what it meant. When landlady said he cleared out 2 days ago. Left cash for the remainder of his rent, no forwarding information. He tied the horse and came up onto the porch. Dutch was behind him, and Dutch looked like a man who had already been through the same thinking process, and arrived somewhere grim. Someone warned him. After Salter. He saw us at the land office and knew we were building something. When we caught the man last night, Cade found out by morning. She pressed her lips together. He has a communication system. Everett looked at her. If Cade's gone, we lose the direct link between the sabotage and Argent. Not entirely. She held up the document she'd been working on all morning. I have a sworn written account of what he told us. And we have the tools. And we have the damaged pipe coupling that Dutch recovered. She paused. It's not the same as Cade himself testifying. But it's not nothing. A judge might not accept a written account from a witness who can't be cross-examined. A judge who isn't in Argent's pocket might. She met his eyes. Won't have, Cade. We still have the deed. We still have the survey records coming from the territorial office. We still have 2 years of grazing logs that establish your water use. She held his gaze. We haven't lost this. We've lost one piece. He looked at her for a long moment. And he exhaled, and some of the force went out of his shoulders. Not all of it, but some. You're right, he said. It cost him nothing to say it. Oh, that was something she'd noticed about Everett Hayes. He could be wrong and say so with the same steadiness he used for everything else, and there was no performance in the admission, no damage to his sense of himself. She had known men who couldn't do that. She found it remarkable every time she saw it. We still have a case, she said. We just have to build the rest of it tight enough that Cade doesn't matter. We have 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she agreed. Then let's not waste them. The territorial survey records arrived in the 3rd week of August, and they were better than Clara had hoped. The package came from Santa Fe, thick, official, smelling of dust and old paper, and she opened it at the study desk with Everett standing behind her. And she went through each page with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned not to react to good news until she had verified that it was in fact good news and not just good-looking news. It was good news. The original 1,865 survey, and filed by the territorial government when Everett's father received his land grant, was explicit beyond any reasonable interpretation. The creek was named. The water rights were attached to the Hayes deed as a primary resource. The survey boundary lines placed the eastern grazing land, all of it, inside the Hayes property line. And the survey notes, handwritten cramped in the particular shorthand of a territorial surveyor who had been doing this work for 20 years and assumed everyone reading his notes understood the conventions indicated that the Argent family had been informed in 1871 when they filed their own deed that their eastern boundary ended at the Hayes fence line. They had known. They had filed a deed claiming land they had been explicitly told wasn't there. They had spent 11 years quietly maneuvering the legal system and the local political landscape to make their claim look legitimate. Clara sat back in the chair. She was quiet for a moment. They knew, she said. From the beginning. This isn't a boundary dispute that got out of hand. This was deliberate. Everett's voice from behind her was very controlled. This changes the nature of the case. It's not just a property disagreement. It's fraudulent filing. She turned to look at him. If we can get the circuit court judge to look at this survey alongside the original deed filing date, Argent isn't just going to lose the boundary claim. He's going to have to answer for the filing itself. They'll say his father acted in good faith. His father was notified. She pointed to the survey notes. It's in here. The surveyor's notation says adjacent property holder informed of boundary determination. That's a legal record of notification. You can't claim good faith when there's a record, you were told. She put the survey page down and picked up the deed comparison she'd prepared. We go to court with this, we don't just win your water rights. We potentially open Argent to fraud liability. Everett was quiet. He had read his quiet. By now, this one was the quiet of someone processing something large, turning it over, examining every face of it before speaking. That will make him dangerous, he said finally. He's already dangerous. Dangerous. A man fighting a boundary claim fights to win a piece of land. A man facing fraud liability fights to stay out of prison. He moved around to the side of the desk, not sitting, just shifting position the way he did when he was thinking through something physical, as if the thought required his whole body to process it. He's going to come hard before September. She had been thinking the same thing. We need to be ready for that. What does that look like? It looks like everything we have goes somewhere safe that isn't here. Copies of every document, certified, lodged with someone Argent can't reach. She thought for a moment. Does the circuit court clerk accept pre-filed evidence? I don't know. Find out today if possible. She started making a list. And we need a lawyer who isn't afraid of Argent. Not someone local, someone from outside the county. I know someone in Pueblo, he said. A woman named Foster who handles land cases. She turned down work from Argent 2 years ago. He made it known he wasn't happy about it. They looked up. She turned down money from Argent. She didn't like the nature of the case he was presenting. She can read a deed. Clara paused. Write to her today. Send everything we have, the deed comparison, the survey, the grazing logs, account of the sabotage. Send her copies, not originals. Keep the originals here. She held his gaze. And Everett. The originals need to be in the strongbox, and the strongbox needs to be somewhere other than the study. Looked at her for a moment. You think he'll come for the documents? He came for your water. Documents are easier to lose than water pipes. She kept her voice even. I've seen men like Argent before. My father dealt with one smaller scale, same pattern. When they feel the ground shifting under them, they stop being methodical and start being desperate. Desperate men do direct things. He studied her face. Your father dealt with a man like Argent. The man who held his debt originally wasn't Gerald Holt. It was a merchant named Freeze, who wanted my father's location on the trade road. She picked up the survey notes and began rolling them carefully. My father was smarter about people than about land. He found a way out, but it took him 5 years and cost him things he didn't get back. She looked up. I'd rather not spend 5 years on this. What did your father's situation teach you? He asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, the kind he asked when he wanted information and understood that she had it. That the law is only as useful as the person applying it, she said. A good case in front of a bad judge is a loss. A moderate case in front of an honest judge can be a win. Documents matter. The judge matters more. She paused. Tell me about Hendricks. The circuit court judge. Honest, Everett said. Old. He came up from Texas in '68 and has been riding the circuit for 14 years. He has no patience for what he calls theatrical lawyering, making arguments that sound good and mean nothing. He thought for a moment. He respects evidence. Then we give him the clearest possible evidence and let it speak. She finished rolling the survey notes and tied the ribbon around them. He'll see what we're showing him. A letter from Argent came 4 days later. It was delivered by a rider Clara didn't recognize, not one of Argent's regular men, a neutral party hired to carry correspondence, which told her Argent was being careful about appearances. The letter was addressed to Everett Hayes and was written in the formal language of a man who had a lawyer, which Argent did, 2 of them, and who wanted everything on record. Everett read it once, handed it to her. She read it twice. It was an offer, framed as generosity, a fair market price for the Hayes property, well above what Argent might have offered a year ago, accompanied by language about mutual benefit and the growing importance of consolidated ranching operations in the territory. It was in its own way an elegant document. You could read it and miss, unless you were paying attention, the sentence buried in the 3rd paragraph that said the offer was contingent on the withdrawal of any pending legal claims related to boundary determinations. He wanted them to drop the case. He was willing to pay for the whole ranch to make that happen. He's scared, she said. Everett said nothing. This is not what a man does when he thinks he's going to win, she said. This is what a man does when he's found out that someone has been to the land office and pulled his deed and had the territorial survey records sent down. She set the letter on the desk. He knows what we have, and he's trying to buy it away before September. Price is fair, Everett said. His voice was entirely neutral. She looked at him. Is that a consideration? He met her eyes. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and she let the silence stand because she had learned that with Everett Hayes, silence was often more honest than anything he said out loud. My father built this place, he said finally. He filed that deed in 1865. He sank the first fence posts and dug the first water line and built the barn in the first winter, with 2 hired hands and a lot of cold. He looked at the letter. I've spent 12 years running it after him. 12 years of exactly this, the cattle and the land and the creek in winter. A pause. It's not a consideration. Then we write back and decline. I'll write back and decline. She picked up her pen. I'll draft the language. He almost smiled. She was becoming more certain she could identify it, that micro-movement at the corner of his mouth that preceded nothing, went nowhere but existed. I assumed you would, he said. The reply was brief and formal, and entirely without hostility, because hostility gave a lawyer things to work with. It declined the offer, expressed appreciation for the proposal, and noted that the Hayes property was not available for sale at any price. Clara had Everett read it before he signed it, and he read it with his usual care and then looked up and said, You left a door open at the end. Why? She pointed to the last line. Because a man who is truly cornered and knows it will sometimes choose to negotiate rather than fight. We want him to feel like negotiation is still possible, right up until the moment the judge rules. If he thinks the case is over before September, he has nothing to lose by destroying what he can. Everett read the last line again, nodded, signed. The rider went back down the mountain with the reply, and Clara watched him go from the porch and felt the particular clarity of a situation that had passed the point of negotiation and was moving, now, toward conclusion. She just didn't know yet what the conclusion would cost. She found out on a Tuesday. She had gone to the creek herself that morning, not for the water line, which Dutch checked daily with the thoroughness of a man who had been made a fool of once and intended never to repeat the experience, but to check the upstream boundary markers that formed one of the key pieces of their grazing history documentation. She needed to note the exact positions for the legal filing to match them against the original survey markers from 1865. Jessie was supposed to ride with her. Jesse had woken up that morning with a fever that had him pale and shaking in the bunkhouse doorway, and Clara had told him to go back to bed with the firmness of a person who was not interested in being argued with, and had gone alone because the boundary markers were half a mile from the house, and it was broad daylight, and she was not going to rearrange the entire day's work because Jesse had caught a summer cold. She found the first marker without trouble. She was noting the coordinates in her book when she heard the horses. 3 riders, coming up from the south, which was not the direction of the road. She knew immediately, not panic, something colder than panic, more useful. She closed her notebook. She looked at the terrain around her. She calculated distance back to the ranch house and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has done enough arithmetic to know when the numbers don't work, that she was not going to make it back before they reached her. She stood her ground. The 3 men pulled up. She recognized the one in the center, not Argent himself, not Wade, but a man named Tillis, who ran the Argent operation's less official business. She had heard his name from the young man they'd caught at the waterline. Nick not expected to see him this far north on Hayes land. Miss Whitmore, Tillis said. He tipped his hat in the same way Wade had, the mockery of courtesy that the Argent men seemed to practice as a form of art. You're a ways from the house. I'm on Hayes' property, she said. You're also a ways from where you're supposed to be. We're just riding. He looked at the notebook in her hand. What are you writing? Ranch business. Mind if I take a look? Yes, she said. I mind considerably. Tillis exchanged a look with the man on his left. She tracked it. Not violent, not yet, but considering. The look of men who had been given instructions that had some flexibility in them, who were deciding how much flexibility this particular moment warranted. Mr. Argent would like to discuss a few things, Tillis said. He's sent me to extend an invitation to come down to the valley. Just a conversation. I received Mr. Argent's written communication 4 days ago, she said. Mr. Hayes replied, if Mr. Argent wants further discussion, he can write again. This is a more personal invitation. Yeah. I'm not interested in personal invitations from Thomas Argent. She held the notebook and kept her voice level and her feet planted, and she thought about Dutch, and his instructions don't move until you have to, and she did not move. I'll ask you to leave Hayes' property now. Tillis looked at her for a long moment. He was measuring something, she could feel it, the calculation going on behind his eyes. He was measuring what they'd been told they could do against what they could actually justify doing to a woman standing on open ground in broad daylight on land that didn't belong to them. Whatever he calculated, it came out on the side of caution. We'll be seeing you again, Miss Whitmore, he said. His horse. The other 2 followed. They rode south, not hurrying, and she watched them go until she could not see them anymore. Then she walked back to the ranch. She walked at a normal pace because she did not want to run, and because running didn't actually make her move faster enough to matter and used energy she needed for thinking. She found Everett in the barn. She told him everything. Exactly as it happened, ate her, in order, with the specific words Tillis had used, because she had memorized them as she was standing there. He listened without interrupting. His expression did not change during the telling of it, but by the end, she was aware of a quality in the air around him that was new or not new exactly, but a heightened. Something that had been a low-controlled burn for weeks was sitting closer to the surface. He sent 3 men to approach you, he said. To intimidate me, she said. That was the purpose. They weren't going to do anything in daylight on marked Hayes land. They just wanted me rattled. She paused. I'm not rattled. But I want you to know it happened. You shouldn't have gone alone. Jesse was sick. You should have waited for someone else. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not anger at her. She understood, but the specific frustration of a person who has been responsible for something and has found out about a risk they didn't manage in time. Nothing happened, she said. This time. He looked at her steadily. Clara. And the use of her first name, the first time he had used it, she realized, in all these weeks landed with a specificity that stopped her argument before she could make it. He's moving. The letters, the intimidation, he's running out of patience. Which means he's running out of time. A pause. From now on, you don't go anywhere on this property alone. Not half a mile, not to the garden. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Not because she thought the risk was as acute as he did. Because she could see, looking at him, that this was not about managing her. This was about something else, something that had been building since the night watches and the thermos of coffee and the quiet mornings, and the way he'd said her name just now, her actual name, like it was something he'd been careful with. All right, she said again, quietly. He held her gaze for one more beat. Then he turned. I'm going to ride the south boundary today. I want to know how they came up. Dutch will go with you if you need to go out. Nodded. He started to leave Everett. He stopped. He's trying to scare us off the case, she said. It means he knows the survey records arrived. It means he knows what we have is strong enough to threaten him. She held his eyes. That's a good sign. He looked at her. And then something happened that she hadn't seen before and hadn't known to expect. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have stopped trying to keep a distance from, stopped trying to maintain the careful, managed space around. Simply looked at it directly without the management. Yes, he said, it is. He left. She stood in the barn for a moment after he'd gone, with the summer heat pressing in through the open doors, and the horses shifting in their stalls and the particular residue of a significant moment. And she thought about the way he'd said her name, and the way he'd looked at her just then, and the way this situation, which had begun with a debt and a desperate calculation and an iron key, had become something she did not have the right word for yet. But she was going to need to find one. 3 days before the September court date, everything went wrong at once. The first thing was the lawyer. The reply from Foster and Pueblo had been encouraging. She'd reviewed everything Clara sent and agreed the case had merit and said she could be in Caldwell Creek by the first week of September. New letter, delivered that morning, said she could not. It said, in language that was carefully chosen and entirely unrevealing about actual causes, that a conflict had arisen that prevented her from taking the case. Twidis handed it to Everett, watched him read it. Argent got to her, Everett said, or threatened her with enough that she weighed the cost. Clara kept her voice measured. Either way, we're 3 days out with no lawyer. Circuit Court allows self-representation. In simple disputes, yes. This is not a simple dispute. We're presenting fraud evidence. We need someone who knows how to do that in front of a court. She was already thinking. Who else? Think. Anyone in the territory outside Argent's reach. There's a man in Colorado Springs. Harrison. I've heard his name in connection with land cases. Can we reach him in 3 days? Telegraph. She was already on her feet. I'll write the message. You need to have someone write it to the telegraph office today, not tomorrow. Today. We need a reply by tomorrow night at the latest to have time to brief him before the hearing. He sent Jesse, who had recovered from his fever with the resilience of youth and was itching for something useful to do. Jesse rode at a pace that suggested he understood the urgency, and Clara stood at the gate watching him go and felt the specific anxiety of a person who has done everything correctly and is now waiting on variables outside their control. Second thing went wrong at noon. Dutch came into the house without knocking, which he had never done before. She and Everett both looked up, Clara from the study desk, Everett from the kitchen doorway. East heard, Dutch said. Someone cut the fence. They were moving before he finished the sentence. 40 head of cattle had gone through the break in the east fence line, which put them on the disputed boundary land, the exact stretch of grazing territory that was central to the court case. If the cattle were on that land when Argent's men came, and Clara had no doubt that Argent's men would come, this was not an accident, and that it was timed. Argent could make a counter-argument that Hayes' cattle regularly trespassed on his territory, which was the mirror image of Hayes's own grazing use case, and could muddy the record enough to give a judge pause. It was elegant in the manner of something designed to cause maximum damage at minimum risk. She found herself almost grudgingly acknowledging it, even as she moved. as Everett said, and Paz was already on his horse. We need to get them back across the line before anyone sees them there, she said. And we need to document the fence cut, photograph it if we can, write it down if we can't, with the date and time and the nature of the cut. Same as the water pipe, Everett said. Deliberate, she said. Not where, cut. She looked at him, added to the filing. It's a pattern now. 2 incidents of deliberate sabotage to Hayes' property in the 6 weeks preceding the court date. That's not a coincidence. A judge can see a pattern. If we get a lawyer who can present it, if she agreed. They got the cattle back across the line in 2 hours. Dutch documented the fence cut with the methodical thoroughness that was his particular gift, noting details that would not have occurred to anyone not paying the kind of attention Dutch paid to physical evidence. Paz rode the perimeter twice and found no Argent riders, which meant they had been either very fast or very lucky, or Argent had simply trusted the cattle to cause damage before anyone noticed. Clara sat with the documentation Dutch produced and added it to the court file. She had grown over these weeks, from a handful of documents into something substantial, a record of a long, deliberate campaign against a legal landowner. Documented piece by piece, that told a clear story if you knew how to read it. She knew how to read it. The question was whether Harrison from Colorado Springs would know how to present it. Harrison's reply came the next evening. He could be there. He had reviewed the Telegraph summary and said the case had, and this was his exact word, teeth. Yeah, he would need 3 hours with the documents the morning before the hearing. He asked Everett to confirm that the originals were secure. Clara wrote the confirmation herself and sent it back. He's coming, she told Everett. They were on the porch the first time she could remember simply being on the porch in the evening, without a specific task driving it. The summer was tipping, the August heat, beginning its slow retreat at the altitude of the ranch, and the evenings had that particular quality of late summer in the mountains, cool and carrying something of what was coming. He's coming, Everett repeated. Going to court in 2 days with a lawyer who has teeth in a case built on 11 years of their fraud and 6 weeks of evidence of sabotage. She looked at the valley below, the lights of Caldwell Creek faint and distant. We're going to win this. He was quiet beside her. She was used to his quiet. She had stopped filling it reflexively and started listening to it, which was different. What happens after? He asked. She looked at him. Question was careful, specific. It was not about the case. I haven't decided, she said, which was true. She had been deciding, for weeks, in the way of a person who is aware they are deciding something without quite admitting to themselves that the decision is being made. You don't have to decide now, he said. I know. She looked at the dark valley. Where would I go if I left? Anywhere you wanted. You could set up accounting services. Any town in the territory would take on someone who can read a deed the way you do. His voice was even. You do well, she said again. Another long silence. The kitchen garden needs work before winter, she said. He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the valley, and she knew he was looking at her, and she let him look, and she let the statement stand there between them, in the late summer air, without explanation. Because she had found with Everett Hayes that the things you didn't explain were often the ones that didn't need it. She heard him exhale. It does, he said. And then, carefully, the way he did everything that mattered, he reached over and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the porch rail. He didn't say anything. She didn't pull away. The valley below them was quiet, and the stars were coming out above the mountain. And in 2 days, a circuit court judge named Hendricks was going to walk into a courthouse in Caldwell Creek with no connection to Thomas Argent and no patience for theatrical lawyering. He was going to look at 11 years of fraud and 6 weeks of sabotage, and a deed that said exactly what it said. Clara turned her hand over under his, and his fingers closed around hers, and that was the whole of it. No words, no declaration. Nothing dramatic. And just 2 people who had been fighting the same fight on the same ground, and had found, somewhere in the middle of it, that they did not want to be anywhere else. The courthouse was still 2 days away, and Thomas Argent was not done. moved the night before the hearing. Clara woke to the sound of horses, not one, not two, the kind of number that has weight to it, that you feel in the ground, before you fully hear it. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully conscious, and what she saw in the yard below was 4 riders, and the one in front was not Tillotson and was not Wade. It was Thomas Argent himself. She dressed in 30 seconds. She was out of her room and in the hallway before she registered that Everett's door was already open. He had heard it too, or hadn't slept, or both. She found him at the front door, and he had his rifle, and she put her hand on his arm before he opened it. "Don't," she said. "Not like this. Not with a rifle in your hands the night before a hearing." She held his eyes. "That's what he wants. He wants something to happen tonight that makes tomorrow impossible." A long taut second. She felt the tension in his arm under her hand, controlled, but barely. Then he lowered the rifle, leaned it against the wall. Opened the door with empty hands. Argent was already dismounting. He was older than Clara had expected from the way people talked about him, mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent decades being the largest presence in every room he entered. He took his time walking to the porch, and she understood that the taking of time was itself a message, the message of a man who believed he owned whatever ground he stood on. "Hayes," he said. He looked at Clara with the flat, assessing gaze of someone pricing livestock. "Miss Whitmore." "It's after midnight," Everett said. His voice was entirely level. "Whatever this is, it can wait until morning." "I'm afraid it can't." Argent reached into his coat and produced a document. He held it out. "Not to Everett. To Clara. I thought you might want to read this before you walk into that courthouse." She took it. She read it. The world went very still. It was a sworn affidavit. Filed that afternoon with the county clerk. She could see the timestamp, could see the clerk's seal, and it was signed by Gerald Holt. It stated that Clara Whitmore had approached Holt in the weeks before her father's death and offered him information about the Hayes property's water access in exchange for leniency on her father's debt. It stated that she had described the creek boundary in terms that suggested prior knowledge of the property's legal vulnerabilities. It stated that her subsequent arrangement with Everett Hayes was motivated not by necessity, but by a deliberate plan to place herself inside the Hayes operation for purposes that were not disclosed to Hayes himself. It said in plain language, designed to be read in court, that Clara Whitmore had been working against Everett Hayes from the beginning. Ish read it twice. She was aware of Everett beside her, aware that he had not tried to take the document from her, was waiting for her to process it first. She was also aware, with the cold clarity that had served her since she was 13 years old and balancing her father's books, that this document was designed with a specific precision. It wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on every piece of evidence she had gathered. If the court believed she had entered the Hayes household under false pretenses, every document she had touched, every finding she had made, every account she had compiled became suspect. The comparison, the survey analysis, the grazing logs. All of it, potentially, fruit of a compromised investigation. "Holt is lying," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Gerald Holt is a respected banker and a deacon of the church," Argent said. He said it without particular satisfaction, the way you say a thing that doesn't require embellishment. "His word carries weight. His word is bought," she said. "The same way the county surveyor was bought, and Foster in Pueblo was bought, and the man named Cade who ran your sabotage operation was bought. You buy things, Mr. Argent. That's what you do." Something moved across Argent's face. Not anger. She had expected anger, and was prepared for it. What she saw was worse than anger. It was the calm of a man who has been called exactly what he is, and doesn't particularly care because he doesn't believe he can be stopped. "What I do," Argent said, "is protect what's mine. That land has been in practical Argent use for a decade. Legal niceties you've been assembling don't change that reality." He looked at Everett. "I'll make the same offer I made in the letter. Fair price. You walk away without the complication of a hearing where this young woman's credibility is going to be examined in a great deal of detail." Everett was quiet for a moment. Clara did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Argent. "No," Everett said. Argent tilted his head slightly. "You haven't thought about it. I don't need to." Everett's voice had the quality that very still water has surface calm over considerable depth. You rode up here at midnight to show us a piece of paper you had Holt sign this afternoon, because you've had 6 weeks to think of something better, and this is what you came up with. That tells me what you've got." He held Argent's gaze. "I'll see you in the courthouse tomorrow." Argent looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, and the look was different from the first one, still flat, still assessing, but with something underneath it that she recognized after a moment as something she had not expected to see in this man. Uncertainty. "Think carefully about what you're walking into," Argent said. "We've done our thinking," Clara said. "Good night, Mr. Argent." He left. The 4 riders left. The sound of horses faded down the mountain, and when it was fully gone, Clara let out a breath that had been waiting a long time. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. Everett sat beside her, not close, but beside her. "Made that up," she said. Not defending herself, she was past that. Just stating it. "Holt never spoke to me about Hayes' property. My father had the debt before I was old enough to know what a land boundary was." "I know," Everett said. She looked at him. "You didn't hesitate." "No. He's going to present that affidavit in court tomorrow. Harrison needs to be ready to counter it. We'll be up in 2 hours. We'll brief Harrison before the sun is fully up." He was calm. The kind of calm she had initially read as coldness and had since understood was the particular steadiness of a person who had been hit so many times that impact no longer caused them to lose their footing. Can Holt be cross-examined? She thought about that. If he's presented as a witness to support the affidavit, Harrison can request cross-examination. She turned it over carefully. Holt is a deacon of the church. He has a reputation for honesty in his business dealings. But he is also a man who held my father's debt at an interest rate that would have been usurious in most jurisdictions, and he had conversations with Argent about that debt that would be very interesting to hear described under oath. "So we go after Holt. We let Harrison go after Holt," she said. With specific questions. About when Argent first approached him about the Whitmore debt. About the interest rate. About whether any portion of the debt value was ever transferred or discussed with Argent's office before my father died. She paused. "Holt is a man who signed a lie this afternoon, but he's not a man who has practiced lying under oath. There's a difference." Everett looked at her profile in the dark. She could feel him looking. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not a compliment so much as an observation, careful and precise. "I'm afraid," she said. "I've been afraid since midnight." Afraid doesn't mean stopped. She turned to look at him. "Is this what it was like for you? For 2 years?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "but I was doing it alone." She felt that land somewhere in the center of her chest. "You're not doing it alone now." He didn't look away. "No," he said, "I'm not." They sat there for a while, on the porch, in the late summer mountain dark, and Clara's mind was moving through everything: the affidavit, the questions for Harrison, the order of evidence, the likely shape of Argent's presentation. But underneath the thinking, and steady and separate from it, was the weight of his shoulder near hers, and the knowledge that in a few hours they were going to walk into a courthouse and do the hardest thing, and that they were going to do it together. Harrison arrived at the ranch at 4 in the morning. He was a small man, which surprised Clara. She had expected someone built more like the weight of what he carried, but Harrison was compact and quick and had eyes that moved over documents the way a hawk's eyes moved over a field. He read everything in 90 minutes flat. He asked questions that were precise and answered with minimal follow-up, which told her he was understanding the materials on first read rather than building toward understanding. When he got to the Holt affidavit, he set it down. He looked at Clara. "Did any conversation of this nature occur?" "No," she said. He studied her face for exactly two seconds. Good. That kind of certain is hard to fake and easy to see." He picked up the affidavit again. Holt's language here is general terms that suggested prior knowledge. That's not a specific claim. It's an impression. Impressions can be reframed. He set it down again. Me. About Holt's connection to Argent. Everything you know in order. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was already more than either of the previous lawyers had managed. When she finished, he looked at Everett. You said Holt held this debt at an elevated interest rate. Significantly elevated, Clara said. Did your father sign a note with the rate specified? He did. I have it. She pulled it from the file. She had brought every original document downstairs when she heard Argent's horses, and had put them all in the satchel, some instinct telling her not to let them out of arm's reach tonight. Harrison looked at the note. He looked at Clara, and he said, with the first thing approaching satisfaction she had heard from him, usurious interest in a personal debt arrangement has specific legal implications in this territory. Particularly when that arrangement was made with a party who had a financial relationship with an adjacent property holder. He set the note down on top of the affidavit. If I can establish that Holt's debt arrangement with your father was financially motivated by Argent's interest, even stagely, then Holt's testimony becomes the testimony of a financially interested party, not a neutral witness. Can you establish that? Everett asked. I can make the argument. Whether I can prove it depends on what Holt says under cross-examination. Harrison looked at both of them. People who sign lies often believe those lies will never be closely examined. Courtroom is a very close examination. Gathered the documents into neat order. I'm ready. Are you? The Caldwell Creek Courthouse was a single large room with benches for spectators and a raised platform for the judge and a long table for evidence. When Clara walked in with Everett and Harrison at 8 in the morning, every bench was full. She had not expected that. She should have. This was the kind of case that a town like Caldwell Creek would turn out for Hayes against Argent, the mountain cowboy against the valley's largest landowner, 2 years of legal conflict coming to a conclusion. People had opinions about it. They had brought those opinions with them and were wearing them openly. She could feel the room's alignment in the way people looked at her as she walked to the plaintiff's table. Not all of them were hostile. Mrs. Pruitt was in the third row and gave Clara a nod that contained a complete sentence. Puz was in the back, which surprised her because she hadn't known he was coming. Patterson from the Salterland office was there, which surprised her more, and when she caught his eye, he looked away quickly, in a manner that told her he was there, because he felt he needed to be, not because he wanted to be. Argent was at the defense table with 2 lawyers she didn't recognize. Aide was behind him. Tillis was in the gallery, and he looked at her with the flat professional regard of a man who was there to watch and report back. Gerald Holt was in the front row of spectators. He was gripping his hat in his lap and not looking at anyone. Judge Hendricks came in, and the room stood and sat, and Hendricks was exactly what Everett had described old Texas built. With the expression of a man who had heard every theatrical argument the territory had to offer and was permanently unimpressed by all of them. He looked at the room once. This is a property and water rights hearing. It is not a public entertainment. Anyone who treats it as such will be removed. We begin. The first hour was technical. Harrison presented the deed. He presented the original land grant. He presented the 1,865 survey. He walked Hendricks through the boundary language, with the kind of patience that was not condescending because it was clearly in service of precision rather than simplification. And Hendricks followed it and asked 2 questions that told Clara he was already seeing what they needed him to see. Argent's lawyers presented their deed, their survey, their interpretation of eastern water access. Hendricks looked at both surveys side by side and said, the Hayes survey names the creek. The Argent survey names a spring. These are not the same source. Argent's lead lawyer, a polished man named Keller from Denver, who had the smooth, unhurried manner of someone charging by the hour, said, "Honor. Common usage over 11 years has established the creek as the practical water boundary." Common usage established by whom? Hendricks asked. The Argent operations. Hendricks repeated. Voice had not changed in volume but had changed in texture. The party seeking to claim the resource. Is that the argument? Keller paused in the manner of a man recalculating. By the practical realities of ranching operations in the territory. Show me in this survey where common usage supersedes the named source, Hendricks said. He set the Argent survey down on the table. Show me the language. Keller could not show him the language. The language was not there. Clara watched this from the plaintiff's table and did not allow herself to react, but she felt the shift in the room, the particular change in atmosphere, when a strong argument turns out to have a hollow center. That was the first mini-victory. There were more coming. And then Argent's lead lawyer said, "Your Honor, before we proceed with the property arguments, I'd like to introduce an affidavit relevant to the integrity of the plaintiff's evidence gathering." Hendricks looked at him. What affidavit? Pertaining to the individual who compiled the plaintiff's documentary evidence. A Miss Clara Whitmore, who is present in the courtroom. Harrison was on his feet before the sentence was finished. Objection, Your Honor. The affidavit referenced was filed late yesterday afternoon, well past the discovery deadline for this hearing. It has not been provided to plaintiff's counsel in time for proper review. Hendricks looked at Keller. Is that accurate? Keller managed a smooth recovery. Information came to light only yesterday, Your Honor. The timing was unavoidable. Timing, Hendricks said, with precisely the intonation of a man who has been on this bench for 14 years and can hear the difference between unavoidable and strategic, was yesterday afternoon. One day before this hearing, he looked at Harrison. You've seen the document? It was hand-delivered to the plaintiff last night, Harrison said. At midnight by the defendant himself. A low sound moved through the courtroom. Hendricks let it settle and then looked at Keller with expression and swag that Clara thought must have made many lawyers before him reconsider their career choices. At midnight, he repeated. The delivery method was unconventional. Mr. Keller. Keller sat. I'll review the affidavit, Hendricks said. I will also hear from the affiant. He looked at the room. Is Gerald Holt present? Holt's head came up from the front row. Come forward, Mr. Holt. Holt on the stand was a different proposition than Holt behind his desk. Behind his desk, he had the natural authority of a man in his own territory, with his practiced politeness and his banker's composure. Nan. On the stand, in front of a room full of people who knew him, with Hendricks looking at him and Harrison standing ready, he was just a man who had signed something and was now being asked to explain it. Harrison was precise. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. Holt to describe the nature of his financial relationship with Clara's father. Holt described it. Harrison asked about the interest rate. Holt stated it. Harrison asked whether that rate was standard for the time and territory. Holt said he believed it was within normal range. Harrison produced 3 other debt notes from the same period, handled by Holt's bank, with interest rates significantly lower, asked Holt to explain the discrepancy. Holt said the risk profile of the Whitmore debt was higher. Harrison asked what specifically made it higher. Holt said the property value relative to the debt amount. Harrison pointed out, with 3 sentences and a number, that the property value exceeded the debt by a factor that made the risk argument difficult to sustain. Holt said there were other factors. Harrison asked him to name them. Holt could not name them. Then Harrison asked when Thomas Argent had first spoken to him about the Whitmore debt. The room went absolutely still. Holt said he didn't understand the question. Harrison repeated it, verbatim, in the same tone. Holt said he had had a conversation with Argent about General Valley property matters that might have included some discussion of. When, Harrison said. Holt stopped. I'm asking for a date. Holt, approximately, within a month. Holt's grip on his hat in his lap tightened visibly from where Clara sat. Perhaps sometime in the spring. Before Mr. Whitmore's death? Harrison asked. The silence in the room was the kind that happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand something. I don't recall spring, Harrison said. Before the death. Before Miss Whitmore knew she would inherit the debt. Before she had any reason to be involved with the Hayes property. He looked at Hendricks. Your Honor, the affiant is describing a conversations about this specific debt that occurred before the debt became relevant to Miss Whitmore, which is consistent with a pattern of pre-planning that is directly relevant to the fraud allegations in this case. He turned back to Holt. Mr. Holt, did Thomas Argent ask you to hold that debt and foreclose at a specific time? I object, Keller said, not standing. Calls for... Overruled, Hendricks said. He was looking at Holt. Answer the question, Mr. Holt. Holt looked at his hat. Looked at Argent. Argent's face was stone. And then, Gerald Holt, a deacon of the church, a banker of 20 years, man of practiced politeness and calculated courtesies, said, asked me to be patient with the note and to act when the time was right. The room erupted. Hench brought down his gavel twice. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands flat on the surface, and her heart moving at a pace she was not going to let show on her face. And beside her, Harrison made a small note on his pad in the unhurried manner of a man who had just gotten exactly what he came for. Looked at Argent. He was looking at Holt. And what was on Argent's face now was not uncertainty, it was the specific cold fury of a man who has watched the most important piece of his architecture collapse, and who knows, in this moment, it is not fixable. And looked at Everett. He was already looking at her. The hearing went another 2 hours. Harrison presented the sabotage evidence, Dutch's documentation, the recovered tools, the written account of the young man's son's testimony from the waterline as a pattern of interference designed to economically pressure the Hayes operation in the period immediately preceding the hearing. He presented the grazing logs. He presented the territorial survey notes with their notation about the Argent family being informed of the boundary determination in 1871. Keller made arguments. Some of them were good. Some of them would have been very good in front of a different judge. Hendricks was not that judge. He asked questions that went directly to the core of each argument and stripped away the presentation to find what was underneath. On the grazing logs, he asked whether the cattle use was continuous. Harrison showed him 20 years of records. On the survey notification, he asked whether the Argent deed filing included any record of dispute or challenge to the boundary determination. It did not. On the sabotage evidence, Hendricks looked at the tools and Dutch's documentation for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Keller and said, "These tools were recovered on Hayes property during an unauthorized nighttime entry. Your client has any response?" Keller said the tools could not be definitively linked to the Argent operation. They were used by a man who stated under contemporaneous written testimony that he was hired through a known Argent associate, Hendricks said. He set the tools down. That is a link. It may not be a chain, but it is a link, and I'll note it. At noon, Hendricks said he had heard enough. The room waited. "I find in favor of the plaintiff on the primary boundary dispute," Hendricks said. The Hayes deed, supported by the original territorial survey, establishes clear and prior claim to the creek and all associated water rights. The Argent eastern boundary claim is not supported by the filed deed or the survey of record. He set his papers down. I am further referring the matter of the 1871 Argent deed, filing to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review, given the evidence presented today regarding prior notification of boundary determination. That referral will include the pattern of interference documented in these proceedings. He looked at the room over his glasses. The water belongs to Hayes. The land belongs to Hayes. And the territory's attorney is going to have some questions for Mr. Argent. He stood, "We're done." The gavel came down. Erupted again, and this time Hendricks led it. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table and did not move for a moment. She was aware of Harrison's hand briefly just on the table beside hers, not touching, just present, the acknowledgement of a professional who knows when a thing has been done well. She was aware of Jessie whooping from somewhere in the gallery and being shushed by Dutch. She was aware of Paz in the back of the room, who was not making any noise at all, but whose expression was doing everything noise usually does. She was aware of Argent leaving. He left a hunting look at the room, without looking at anyone, with Wade behind him and Keller speaking low and fast at his shoulder. Tillis had already gone. Holt had already gone. The room was still moving and making noise around her, and Clara Whitmore sat in the middle of it and put her hands in her lap and breathed. Then Everett's hand was on the back of her chair, not her shoulder. Not reaching for her. Just there present, steady, the particular nearness of a person who has learned your space and knows how to occupy the edge of it without crossing. "It's done," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that look she had been learning to read across these weeks, not the barely there almost smile, not the careful neutrality, but the third thing. The thing underneath both of those. The look she had seen on the porch in the dark when he'd reached for her hand. "It's done," she said. Harrison was gathering his papers. Around them the room was beginning to thin, spectators moving toward the door. The specific energy of a concluded public event, dissipating into the ordinary afternoon. Mrs. Pruett appeared at the edge of Clara's vision, and caught her eye and gave her a second nod, this one longer, this one carrying the weight of an old woman, who had made a calculation months ago and was watching it prove out. "What happens now?" Jesse asked. He had materialized at Everett's shoulder with the endearing inability to read a room that was one of his most consistent qualities. "Now we go home," Everett said. Clara looked at him when he said it. He had said it without thinking. She was certain, not as a statement about her situation or her choice, just as the plain description of where they were going. The ranch on the mountain, the kitchen garden that needed work before winter. The room with the lock on the door and the iron key she had not used since the second night. She stood up. She picked up the satchel with the original documents, all of them, intact, untouched by everything Argent had tried. She looked at the plaintiff's table, where months of work had just become a ruling in their favor. Then she looked at Everett Hayes, who was waiting without impatience in the way he waited for everything, and she said, "Let's go." But what she had not accounted for, in the relief of the ruling and the long exhale of a fight finally finished, was what was waiting for them outside the courthouse door. It was not over. Not yet. Wade Argent was waiting on the courthouse steps. Not hired men. Wade himself alone. Which was either brave or stupid, or the particular combination of both that came from a young man who had watched his father's careful architecture collapse in a single morning and had decided that careful was no longer the approach. He was standing at the bottom of the steps with his hat on and his hands at his sides, and when Everett came through the door with Clara beside him, Wade looked at Everett with the specific expression of a person who has made a decision they are not going to unmake. "You think this is finished," Wade said. Everett stopped. Sarah stopped beside him, behind them. She was aware of Harrison pausing in the doorway, and Jesse. And Dutch, who had appeared from somewhere the way Dutch always appeared, already in position, before anyone realized he'd moved. "Judge said what he said," Everett replied. His voice was the same as it always was. "Level. Like weather. My father built that valley," Wade said. 30 years. You don't walk out of a courthouse with a piece of paper and take that." "I'm not taking anything that wasn't mine," Everett said. "I'm keeping what's been mine since 1865. Wade's eyes moved to Clara. They stayed there. "You," he said, "you think you're clever. Riding up that mountain and digging through papers like some kind of—" Everett said, one word, quiet as a door closing. Wade looked back at him. Something crossed his face, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a boundary and the awareness that crossing it would have immediate consequences. He was angry enough to want to cross it. He was not quite angry enough to be entirely stupid. "It isn't done," Wade said. "The territorial attorney's review is going to take months." "Anything can happen in months. Then we'll see what happens," Everett said. "Step aside, Wade." A long moment, the kind that has weight to it. Clara counted her own heartbeats and kept her face still and her breathing even, because she understood that this moment, not the courtroom, not the gavel, Yet, this was the one that would determine what kind of man Wade Argent chose to be going forward. Jade stepped aside, not gracefully, not with any kind of acceptance. Nay. But he moved, and Everett walked past him, and Clara walked past him, and she did not look back. Nay. She heard Wade's footsteps going in the other direction, fast the footsteps of someone who is walking away from something, before he does something he can't take back. Harrison fell into step beside her. "Well handled," he said quietly. Everett handled it. "You both did." He glanced at her. "The territorial attorney's review is serious. Argent is going to spend the next several months in a very uncomfortable legal position." He paused. "So are Holt and anyone else connected to the deed filing." "Good," she said. It came out plain, without venom, just the clean statement of a person who believes consequences should follow actions. Harrison almost smiled. "I'll send my accounting to the ranch." "8 to me," she said. "I'll handle the payment." Did smile at that. "Yes, ma'am." He went to get his horse. In. Clara stood with Everett in the street outside the Caldwell Creek Courthouse on a September afternoon, summer beginning to concede to something cooler, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Jesse said from behind them, "So do we celebrate or do we just go home?" Dutch said nothing, which was his version of agreeing with the second option. Apos said, in his particular tone of a man who has strong opinions about food and believes this is always the relevant consideration, "There is nothing at the celebration in this town worth eating." Everett looked at Clara. "Home," she said. They were halfway up the mountain when he told her about Margaret. She had not asked. She had over these weeks learned not to ask certain questions, not because she feared the answers, because she had understood that Everett Hayes said things when he was ready and not before. And pushing the timing produced nothing except a man who went quieter than usual, and a conversation that died before it started. He said it without preamble, the way he said most true things. "He had a wife," he said, 8 years ago. Clara kept her horse at the same pace. Waited. "Her name was Margaret. We came up from Texas together. She was the one who wanted the mountain. I would have settled in the valley if she hadn't had a strong opinion about altitude." A pause. Kind that was not hesitation but wait. "She was 6 months into carrying our first child when the accident happened. Waterline, the original one. Before I rebuilt it. It burst in the winter. I went out to fix it in a freeze. I was out there for 6 hours." He stopped. She did not fill the silence. "When I came back, she'd gone to the barn to get me, thinking I was in there." She fell. His voice didn't break. It didn't roughen. It just carried the particular flatness of a grief that has been carried long enough to be inseparable from the carrier. Clara breathed. "Everett." "I don't tell people," he said. "Not because I can't say it, because her produces a kind of sympathy I don't know what to do with." He glanced at her. "Yeah. I'm telling you because you've been in that house for 3 months and you deserve to know why it is the way it is." She thought about the house, the room that had been prepared with a lock and a key. The kitchen garden someone had been maintaining without any evident joy in it. The particular quality of the house of a person who has stopped expecting comfort from their surroundings. Garden, she said, was hers. He looked at the road ahead. "I kept it going because stopping felt wrong. But I don't have her knowledge of it." She sat with that. The garden he'd maintained for 8 years out of loyalty to someone who wasn't there to tend it. New own he'd chosen because she'd wanted it. The lock he'd put on a door 2 days before he rode down to offer it to a stranger, because he had understood, out of some part of himself, that had never stopped thinking about what it meant to respect a person's choice. Whoever came through that door deserved to have one. "I'm not replacing her," Clara said, carefully. "I want you to know that I understand that. Whatever this is, whatever we are to each other, I know I'm not that." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you're not," he said. "You're something else entirely." Another pause. "I've been trying to figure out what to call it." Nair. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. But he was not. She understood. Looking at the road. Me. What have you come up with? The closest I've gotten, he said, is that you're the person I didn't know I was waiting for. B. Because I'd stopped believing there was anything left to wait for. He said it the same way he said everything that was true, without performance, without the soft edges people put around difficult things. Just the plain fact of it, offered directly. She felt something in her chest that was not the hollow place. Not the grief, not the anxiety, not the specific loneliness of a person who has been told for years that she is not quite enough. Something that filled rather than emptied. That's a good thing to have come up with, she said. The edge of his mouth moved. It took me 3 months. You're thorough, she said, and he laughed. Actually laughed, not the almost sound she'd been cataloging, but the real thing, short and genuine and startled out of him, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to and is not sorry he did. It lasted about 4 seconds and then was gone. It had been there, and she had heard it, and she was going to keep it. 3 days after the hearing, the first letter arrived from the territorial attorney's office. Me. It was addressed to Everett Hayes and requested his cooperation in providing documentary evidence related to the 1871 Argent deed filing. Clara read it with him at the study desk and felt the specific satisfaction of a legal process, doing what legal processes are supposed to do, slowly, imperfectly, but in the right direction. They're moving, she said, faster than I expected. Hendricks has a reputation for referring things that should be referred, she said. He doesn't let things sit. She set the letter down. Need to send copies of everything. Originals stay here. She picked up her pen. I'll draft the response. He watched her write. She was aware of him watching, in the way she was always aware of him now, not uncomfortable, not the awareness of being observed, but the awareness of being known. Of being in a room with someone who had decided you were worth knowing, and had done the work of it. Clara, he said. She looked up. He reached into his coat pocket and put something on the desk between them. It was the iron key. She looked at it, then at him. You haven't used it once, he said. I didn't need to. No, he held her gaze. But I want you to know I want to say it plainly, because I think plain is the only way I know how to say important things, that I'm not asking you to stay, because I need someone to keep the books. I'm not asking you to stay because you've made yourself useful, or because winter's coming and it's practical. He paused. Mia. I'm asking you to stay because when I ride out in the morning and know you're here, the ranch feels like something other than a place I'm enduring. She looked at the key on the desk. I had a plan, she said. When all this started, I was going to get through the winter, help you with the legal case. Say this has to set myself up somewhere with accounting work. She picked up the key. I had a whole sensible plan. What happened to it? She turned the key over in her hand. You made coffee in the dark at 4 a.m. and gave me half. He looked at her steadily. That's what did it. That was one thing. She set the key down between them. It was a lot of small things. That's usually how it works, isn't it? Not one large moment. Anne. Just a lot of small moments that add up to something you didn't plan for. Yes, he said. Simply, that's how it works. She left the key on the desk between them. I'll stay, she said, not because of the winter and not because it's practical. She met his eyes. Because this is the first place in my life where what I know has been worth something. Where what I can do has mattered. She paused. And because you laugh when you don't expect to, and I'd like to hear that again. He reached across the desk and picked up the key. He held it for a moment. Then he opened the desk drawer and put it inside, and closed the drawer, and the finality of that small gesture, the key put away, and no longer needed. No longer the terms of anything settled over them both, like something laid down. All right, he said. All right, she said. She went back to drafting the letter to the territorial attorney. He stayed at the desk. Neither of them said anything else for a while. But the study, which had always been a room that felt like work, felt different now in the way rooms feel different when the people in them have decided something. Then came the second twist, the one Clara had not seen coming, because she had been looking at the legal case, and not at Gerald Holt. Holt came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning, alone, riding a horse he was clearly not accustomed to. looking like a man who had made a decision in the night and was in the process of discovering that decisions, made in the night, sometimes look different in morning light. Dutch let him through the gate because Holt was not currently a threat, and because Dutch's judgment about people had proved reliable enough to trust. Clara was in the kitchen garden when she saw him ride in. She set down her tools and watched him look at the house with the expression of approaching a thing they owe something to. She went to meet him before Everett came out. Mr. Holt. He turned. He had not slept. It was visible in the way sleeplessness is visible on men who are not practiced at carrying guilt. It sits on them differently than exhaustion, more exposed, less able to be attributed to honest work. Miss Whitmore. He held his hat in both hands. I'd like to speak with Mr. Hayes. You can speak with me, she said, and then I'll decide what to bring to Mr. Hayes. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who understands he is not in a position to make demands about how this goes. The territorial attorney's office contacted me yesterday, he said. They want a form statement. I expect so. I'm going to give them an accurate one. He held her gaze. No, I want you to know that before they ask for it. I'm not. I've spent 20 years building a reputation in this town, and I signed something that wasn't true because Argent made it very clear what would happen to my bank if I didn't. His jaw tightened. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth of how it happened. She studied him. She was looking for the calculations, the angle, the thing underneath the apology that was serving some other purpose. She had learned to look for it. She did not find it this time. What she found instead was a man who had sat with what he'd done for 72 hours and had arrived at the particular point where the weight of it exceeded the benefit. What do you want from me, Mr. Holt? She asked. I don't want anything from you, he said. I'm here because I owe Hayes a statement that the affidavit was false. In person, not through lawyers, he turned his hat in his hands. And because I owe you an apology that I don't have the right to ask you to accept. She was quiet for a moment. Wait here, she said. Went inside, found Everett in the study, told him what Holt had said. Watched his face go through something she had learned to read, not the carefully controlled neutrality, but the actual working of it. He sat with it for a moment. What do you think? He asked. I think he's genuine, she said, and I think his statement to the territorial attorney, corroborating the falsity of the affidavit, is worth more than anything else we could get at this point. She paused. The decision is yours. He wronged you, not just me. Everett stood. He wronged you through me, he said. That's the same thing. He went outside. Clara followed. The station between Everett and Holt lasted 12 minutes. Clara stood far enough away to give it space, and close enough to hear the shape of it. Holt said what he'd told her, in fuller detail, including when Argent had first approached him and what exactly had been said. Everett listened without interrupting. At the end, Everett said, You'll put all of that in writing. To territorial attorney, under your signature. Yes, Holt said. Then we're done with each other, Everett said. Not angrily, just as the plain statement of the terms. Holt rode away. Everett came back to stand beside Clara and they watched him go. That changes the territorial case, she said. Significantly, he agreed. She looked at him. There was something on his face that she had not seen before, not relief exactly, not satisfaction. Something older than both. The look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just put a piece of it down. Are you all right? She asked. He glanced at her sideways. People keep not being what I expect them to be, he said. Adjusting. Is that bad? No, he said. It's new. He looked at her with the direct look, the third look, the one she'd stopped bracing for. You started it. She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the September sun. I didn't do anything. You read a deed in 4 days that 2 lawyers missed in 8 months, he said. Yeah. And you stood up in the dark and announced yourself to someone you couldn't see because you were more afraid of what would happen if you didn't. He paused. That's not nothing, Clara. She turned toward the kitchen garden. Yeah. Come help me with the winter prep, she said, because she needed to do something with her hands or she was going to say something she wasn't ready to say yet. He came. October arrived the way it does in the high country without asking permission, bringing cold mornings and clear skies, and the particular urgency of a season that does not negotiate. A territorial attorney's case against Argent was formally opened in the second week of October. Holt's statement had been filed. The deed fraud evidence had been formally submitted. The process would take months. That was the nature of territorial law, but the structure of it was solid, and Harrison wrote to tell them that the outcome, in his estimation, was not substantially in question. The Argent operation pulled back from the northern boundary. The cattle that had been drifting onto Hayes land stopped drifting. The fence lines held. The water ran clean through the rebuilt north line, and Dutch checked it every morning and reported nothing of concern, with the satisfaction of a man whose thoroughness had been vindicated. Paz taught Clara 3 of his songs. She learned 2 of them. The third one required a vocal range she did not have, and she told him so directly, and he appreciated the honesty. Jesse got better at not saying the first thing that came into his head. He was working on it, and he was genuinely improving, and he would occasionally look at Everett, and then bavone at Clara, with the expression of a young man who is watching something he does not entirely understand, but approves of strongly. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter properly, which meant it would come back right in the spring. Clara found Margaret's planting records in a box in the pantry, careful, detailed, written in the hand of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing, and she read them with respect and put them back. She would use them in the spring. She thought Margaret would not have objected to that. On a Thursday evening in the middle of October, when the first real cold had come down from the peaks and the ranch house had that particular warmth that comes from a well-built fire and the company of people who have chosen to be where they are, Everett found Clara on the porch. She was looking at the valley. The lights of Caldwell Creek were small and far below, and the stars were doing what mountain stars do in October, performing with the full confidence of something that knows it has no competition. Aimed to stand beside her. "I've been thinking," he said. About what? He was quiet for a moment in the way she knew meant he was going to say something he'd been carrying for a while and was choosing the right words, not because he was uncertain, but because he was careful with important things. "I told you I don't know what to call what you are to me," he said. "I've been thinking about that." She turned slightly toward him. "Have you come up with something better?" "I've come up with something more specific." He looked at the valley and then at her. "I want you to stay, not for the winter, and not for the books, and not because you're useful, which you are, and not because this situation is convenient, which it isn't particularly." He paused. "Men, I want you to stay, because I'd like to spend the rest of my life watching you read a room and see things other people miss. Because the ranch is louder with you in it, and I didn't know until you came that loud was what it needed." Reached out and took her hand, not the way he'd taken it on the porch rail, tentative, careful, but fully, intention. "I'm asking you to marry me, plainly because plain is what I have." She looked at him. She thought about the midnight she'd opened her door to a large, scarred, unsmiling stranger who had offered her a key and the choice of how to use it. She thought about 4 months of water lines and legal documents and night watches and 4 in the morning coffee and one genuine laugh that had lasted 4 seconds and meant more than most speeches she had ever heard. She thought about Caldwell Creek and what it had told her she was worth. She thought about what this mountain had told her instead. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "The books stay mine," she said. "I don't hand them off when we marry. I keep managing the accounts and the legal filing and whatever comes next with the territorial case. This is my work and it stays mine. I was never going to take it from you," he said. It came out almost surprised, like the idea genuinely hadn't occurred to him. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway, because I want it on the record." The edge of his mouth moved. The real movement, the one that preceded the real thing. "All right," he said. "It's on the record." "Then yes," she said. "Plainly, because plain is what I have too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, over the particular place where a person's heart is, and she felt it there, steady and present and real. The heartbeat of a man who had lived on this mountain for 8 years in the specific loneliness of someone who had stopped expecting and who was now, very carefully, beginning to expect again. "All right," he said. His voice was different. Not the level patience she'd learned to read. Something quieter than that and fuller. She leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They stood on the porch of the Hayes Ranch, in the October dark with the valley below, and the stars above and the fire at their backs, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because neither of them needed to. The following spring, when the territorial court finalized the fraud ruling against Thomas Argent, he was assessed penalties that required the liquidation of 2 of his valley properties and the formal cession of all boundary claims against the Hayes, water rights in perpetuity. Wade took the remaining Argent holdings south and did not come back to the Northern Valley, which was, in Clara's assessment, the best outcome available for everyone involved. Gerald Holt resigned from the bank and moved to Denver. He sent Clara a letter before he left. She read it and put it in the correspondence file and did not respond, which was not cruelty, but the plain acknowledgement that some things were done and did not require continuation. Patterson, land office clerk in Salter, kept his job and kept his head down and processed records with, by all accounts, notably increased accuracy in subsequent years. Harrison sent his final accounting. Clara paid it promptly and wrote him a letter of reference in case he ever wanted one, which made him laugh when he read it. She knew because he wrote back and said so. Mrs. Pruitt came to the ranch in May for the wedding, riding the whole way with the backbone of a woman who had made decisions and was not reconsidering them. She sat in the front and wore her good hat and watched Clara Whitmore become Clara Hayes, with the expression of a parent watching a correct answer arrive at the end of a long problem. Dutch stood beside Everett and said nothing, which was how Dutch bore witness to everything he considered important. Us cried quietly and made no effort to hide it. Jesse said 3 things he immediately regretted and was shushed twice. The kitchen garden came back in the spring exactly as Margaret's record said it would, and Clara planted it according to those notes and added 3 things of her own practical additions. Things she had grown up eating and knew how to tend, and the garden held both without any apparent conflict, which she thought was how it should be. Everett watched her work in it one afternoon in June and said nothing, and she felt him watching and did not stop what she was doing and did not explain herself, because she trusted him to understand without explanation. After a while he came and crouched beside her, and she handed him the second trowel, and they worked together in the afternoon sun until the row was done. That was how it was. Not dramatic, not the story anyone in Caldwell Creek would have written for a woman like Clara Whitmore, the woman no one had wanted, the woman sold for a debt, the woman everyone had looked at and seen nothing worth keeping. Not the story she would have written for herself in the dark of her father's house with $437 between her and ruin. But true, the way things are true when they have been earned through every small moment and hard night and 4 in the morning choice, and not a single piece of it taken on faith alone. Everett Hayes had come down the mountain for water rights and a deed dispute, and he had come back up with something he had not known he was looking for. Clara Whitmore had climbed that mountain with a suitcase and her father's ledgers and an iron key, and she had found something no one in Caldwell Creek had ever thought to offer her. A place that was hers, a man who knew her worth and never once thought to set a different price on it. A home not the kind given to you by birth or desperation or the terms of a debt, but the only kind that lasts. The kind you choose